We're going to continue this morning in the series on the life of Nehemiah. And it's interesting because Nehemiah, in fact, we're going to be in this series a couple more weeks as well. But Nehemiah, if you haven't been here, he's an individual who lived an incredibly remarkable life. And I'll just give you a quick summary just so you know where we've been. If you haven't been around, or if you have been, sometimes just good to be refreshed. But Nehemiah is an Old Testament character who is actually a Jew living in the Persian Empire. In fact, he actually lived in the city of Susa, which is a significant distance away from Jerusalem, about 1,000 miles away from Jerusalem. He was the cupbearer to King Artaxerxes, the king of Persia. So the significance of that is just simply that he had a very comfortable life. He had a very good job. Kind of things were moving along in a very positive way for this individual named Nehemiah. But the story of Nehemiah is really fascinating because in the early chapter of Nehemiah, the first chapter of Nehemiah, in the early moments that we see him, he gets word that the people of Israel, the Jews who were living in Jerusalem, who have been released from exile, they've been set free and been given permission not just to go back and rebuild their city, but to rebuild the temple and to become the people that God created them to be, wanted them to be. Nehemiah gets a report that instead of flourishing into that system, instead of rebuilding the city and reinstituting worship and becoming those people, he discovers that they're floundering, discovers that they're literally living among the ruins of the city, and that after 90 years of the freedom and permission to continue on, they actually have made zero progress. They're nothing like what God wanted them to be. And this is what's remarkable about the story and why it's such a beautiful and poignant story for us, is that Nehemiah, even though he lives 1,000 miles away, which in that day might as well have been the distance from the moon to earth in our day, even though he's 1,000 miles removed, even though he has a job where nowhere on his job description does it say he has responsibility for Jerusalem, even though he could just live his very comfortable life where he was, the heart of Nehemiah broke for the people of Jerusalem and broke that God's people weren't flourishing the way they were intended to flourish. And so this story up to this point has really been an opportunity for us to see how not just a group of people, but how an individual moves from a life of floundering to a life of flourishing, going from rubble to the return to the kind of people that God created us to be. And what Nehemiah has shown us is something really significant, a principle that we've been carrying through this series from week one. And that's this, that you and I become our best versions of ourselves, not when we focus on self-improvement, but when we focus on others' improvement. And in other words, what Nehemiah is showing us is that you and I live our most fulfilled life. We become who God created us to be, not when we focus on making ourselves a better version of ourselves, but when we focus on making other people's lives great, when we invest in and sacrifice for the needs of other individuals. That's when we become who we were created to be. And so we've been looking at this. We've been asking some questions. We've been asking questions about Nehemiah's story and then applying them to our life. Like, what breaks our heart? Like, are we allowing our hearts to be burdened for things other than our own personal comfort or our own game plan for our personal lives? Do we get brokenhearted for other situations where things are messed up in the world? The second week, we began to really wrestle with our own comfort and discomfort and said, what are we willing to do about the brokenness that's in our world? Are we willing to get uncomfortable? Are we willing to risk things and actually give of ourselves to solve some of these things? Last week, we talked about where we begin, and we said sometimes the place that we start is right in front of us. And the people that Nehemiah enlisted in building the wall simply opened their eyes to what was right in front of them and began to use their hands and make a difference. All of that leads to a point that I think is very valuable for us to look at, and a part of this story that I think is very relevant for us. And that's what happens when you and I face opposition in this. This week, we're going to see Nehemiah face something in chapter 4 that I think we all face when we begin to step out. Some of you I know, maybe over the last few weeks, you've said, you know what, I really want to do this. Maybe like in week 1, you started to feel something stir. Maybe last week, there's like that party that goes, you know what, there is stuff I can do, and I can start using my life. I can start using my gifts or my abilities to do something about this. When we start to do those things, frequently we begin to face opposition. And the question is, and it's an obvious question for any of us living this life, is, well, how do we interpret, how do we understand, or how do we deal with opposition in our lives? This is why this is an important question to answer, and here's why we're taking the time to do this. Because when you look at not just our experience, but even when you look at the biblical record, you see that this happens. Like people begin to step out. They say, hey man, I'm going to do this thing. And all of a sudden they start facing things they never planned. They were inspired. They were encouraged. They were like, here we go. And next thing you know, somebody's in their face or something's flying up in front of them, causing them to question whether or not they made the right decision. Jesus himself, if you look at the life of Jesus, at his baptism, there is this amazing moment in which God affirms who he is. He says, this is my son in whom I'm well pleased. It's this like pinnacle. And then in the next few pages of the Gospels, he finds himself in the wilderness being tempted and tortured. And you go, well, what's that all about? Why is there a high point followed by a low point? Elijah in the Old Testament has this amazing victory in front of all of the gods of Baal. And then if you keep reading, we find Elijah depressed, like deeply depressed and distraught, hiding and weak. And you go, how can you have this victory and then face opposition and be depressed and hiding? The Apostle Paul has moments in which he expresses his views with boldness. He confronts the corrupt systems of his day and ends up going to prison for it. Over and over, we see that opposition is a part of the narrative of pressing forward for what God wants in the world. And Nehemiah's story is so tangibly good for us because he shows us not just how to respond to it, but even reveals things about the nature of opposition that I think all of us need to hear. All of us need to understand these things. So today, Nehemiah chapter 4, week 1 was chapter 1, 2, 2, 3, 3, and this is week 4, so chapter 4 kind of makes sense. For the first time ever, I make sense. So verse 1 of Nehemiah chapter 4, this is what it says. And just as a kind of back up to this, they've been building the wall of Jerusalem, right? That was like the big thing. We're going to rebuild the wall around Jerusalem. That's the big task. And it says, now when Sanballat heard that we were building the wall, he was angry and greatly enraged, and he jeered at the Jews. So Sanballat is one of the local leaders, one of the local rulers. He's one of the power brokers. He's a guy who has control. And he's a guy who could care less about Jerusalem. He's a guy who could care less about the floundering that's going on. We don't know if he was exploiting the people of Israel. We don't know if he was benefiting just from their plight. All we know is he doesn't care about the floundering, doesn't care about them moving towards flourishing. And in the next few verses, we get a very good sense from Sanballat what opposition looks and feels like. Verse 2 says this, he said in the presence of his brothers and of the army of Samaria, what are these feeble Jews doing? Will they restore it for themselves? Will they sacrifice? Will they finish up in a day? Will they revive the stones out of the heaps of rubbish and burned ones at that? Verse 3, Toby, if you're here a couple weeks ago, Tobiah the Ammonite was beside him, and he said, such a punk, I just don't like Tobiah. Yes, what are they building? If a fox goes up on it, he'll break down their stone wall. Notice what he says about the Jews. There's so much here about the opposition that you and I wrestle with in our lives. He calls them feeble Jews. Feeble. You're feeble. Literally, he's saying you're weak. Not just in physical stature, which maybe they were. I mean, they're an oppressed people. They may have been malnourished. They may have been physically a very unimpressive group of people. But the term that's used is you're weak, like you're weak mentally. Why is he saying this? Well, he's saying this because who do you think you are? Like you've been living among the ruins for 90 years and you've never done anything about it. Like you've been living in this mess right in front of you, and you've not done a thing to solve this. You've been content to do nothing. You've been okay with the brokenness right here in your own front yards. Who do you think you are? You're feeble. You're weak-minded. You're physically weak. You don't have the capacity to do this. Otherwise, you would have by now. Like, who do you people think you are? Will you restore it yourselves? In other words, he looks at this and goes, do you realize how big this is? Like, this is so big. You guys haven't done it yet. You really think you can do this? You really think that you have the ability to do something as significant as rebuild the wall around Jerusalem? You think you can do this on your own. Will you finish it in a day? No, that's kind of a threat. It's like a backhanded threat because he's basically saying this, you better hurry because we don't like what you're doing and we're going to just show up there and we're going to mess with you. We'll come up there and we'll fight you. We'll keep you from completing this. We'll cause confusion. So are you going to finish this in a day? Like, how fast can you work? Because We're coming for you. That's basically what he's saying. And then Toby jumps in. He says, a fox could jump on this and make it crumble. And this is so perfect. This is so much what opposition feels like. He says, your work is not making a difference. What you're doing, this little thing you're doing with the wall here, you're not making a difference. It's flimsy. It doesn't count for anything. And every single thing that these two individuals say parallels the opposition that you and I face when we begin to step out in faith and operate in the life that God has created us for. That's what it feels like. Who do you think you are, right? And some of you know this, right? You know this firsthand. You start to stretch yourself. You start to maybe go, okay, maybe I should do something. Maybe I could serve somewhere. Maybe I could put my hands to use or my ability or my gifts. You start to think, well, maybe there is more to this life than just this physical that I'm touching and feeling. And as soon as you begin to move out, there's this opposition that rises up. And isn't this what it seems to always say to you? Like sometimes it's people, right? I mean, sometimes there are physical people who are up in your face and they're confronting you and they're saying things about you or to you. They're calling you out. They're speaking words. Sometimes these are just the questions that because of circumstances or situations, these are the things that just rise up inside of us, right? These same kinds of questions, right? They're always questions about identity. This is the nature of opposition. They're always questions about identity. Who do you think you are? That's the way it always, there's a predictability to it. There are always questions about influence. Do you really think you could make a difference? Do you really think that you're in a position where that could actually happen because of you? There are always questions about ability. You don't have what it takes. You, on your own, can't accomplish this. That is the nature of opposition. People are going to come in front of us and they're going to say, well, you don't have the kind of story that can actually make you relevant or make you dynamic for people. Like, you don't have the gifts and abilities. Like, you don't know the Bible. Like, you don't have the confidence. You don't do what Brad does or Nick does or, you don't have those kinds of things. You can't speak in front of people. Who do you think you are? Like, you barely know the difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament, right? There's these sorts of questions around ability, around identity, right? Your story. Right? People start questioning your story. But we know where you came from. And you know this too, right? Like, you know your own story. And sometimes people say it and sometimes you're just reminded of it. But you begin to step out and you think, man, my story isn't the kind of story that I don't want anybody to know. Like, if people find out who I am, if people discover that somehow I actually contributed to the rubble at one point in my life, maybe they wouldn't let me work on the wall. So I'll just kind of stay back here and be quiet because my story, it contradicts the story I'm telling today. And so I don't know what to do with that, right? People remind us of our story. They say, who are you? Do you recognize like the insignificance or your influence? You're not in a position of power. You're not in a position like you work in a cubicle farm or you're just a grunt laborer. You're retired and you don't have influence in a business or a company. You're just a student in a school and you're not the one at the head of the class. Like, we have all of these questions about our identity and about our influence that stir up, and the opposition every time is real. This is real stuff, isn't it? And it's real because of this. When you and I begin to identify with Jesus, this is the truth. When you and I begin to identify with Jesus, we're going to be persecuted. It's going to happen. Which I know some of you were like, you waited till week 4 to tell us this, right? Like, I was all excited week 1 to do something, and now you're saying this? Well, I am saying this. When you allow Jesus to begin to use your life, when you begin to become a conduit of His love and His grace and His work in this world, when you begin to let Him leverage your experience, you're going to face opposition. It happens. You're going to be mocked. You're going to be ridiculed. You're going to be disregarded. And when it happens, it takes this same shape over and over. And there are going to be questions about your identity and your influence or your ability. And the question's going to rise like, what difference do you really think you can make? What difference do you think you can make? Opposition has this predictable, repeated pattern, these characteristics that over and over again, they come at us in the same way. And my guess is that for many of you, you've come to this tension, right? You come to this point, and what's causing you to resist living a life of significance is that you've either believed the opposition or you've believed something about the opposition that isn't true. So the reason many of us don't ever take that step is that we either believe the words that the opposition is speaking at us wrongly, or we believe something about the opposition that isn't true. And so here's something that I want you to catch this morning. Something maybe you can memorize it, write it down if you're taking notes, just something to kind of let this roll around in your head. But here's what I want you to know about opposition. Opposition is not a sign that you're doing something wrong. Opposition is an opportunity to remember who you are and who you serve. Catch that? Opposition is not a sign that you're doing something wrong. Opposition is an opportunity to be reminded of who you are and who it is that you serve. Now, one qualifier to this. If you're being a knucklehead, like if you are being selfish and you're doing your own thing and it's all about you and you face opposition, that's actually called consequences for being an idiot. All right? That is not what we're talking about. What we're discussing is opposition in the context of, hey God, I want to use my life for you. Opposition in the context of, I'm going to step out and get uncomfortable. I'm going to put my life on the line. I'm going to risk something for another person. That's the context of the opposition that we're talking about. And that opposition is not a sign that we've made a bad decision. And that opposition is an opportunity to remember who we are and who it is that we're serving. But when you and I, when we begin to step out in faith and we face opposition, there's this tendency, there's this practice, I think, especially among church people. Like it drives me absolutely crazy, if I can just be honest today. It drives me crazy that people read opposition like a signpost. Not like a signpost, like a stop sign, right? Like something that gets in their way and they're like, ooh. Like suddenly God goes from this loving God who's near to us to a drunk uncle who lives upstairs and we don't know what he's doing. Like, what's going on up there, God? Like, I don't know. And like we get opposition and we're like, now it's like, well, God, am I doing the wrong thing? Like, God, should I not be serving? And God's like, yeah, exactly. I want you to live for yourself. That'd be awesome, right? God, this is costing me. It's starting to get uncomfortable. And I feel like, man, some things are happening. I don't really have the time. Like, we start asking these things. It's like, God, is God going to say to you, yeah, you're right. Just go back to living for you. We start to interpret the signs. We start to interpret the things that are happening around us, the opposition, as if it's God telling us to stop. And yet that opposition is never, that's not what the opposition is. Opposition confirms that we're beginning to stretch ourselves and be used for His purposes in a broken world. Opposition is real. Opposition might actually be a sign that you and I are moving in the right direction, not the wrong direction, which doesn't fit well with our comfortable culture, does it? See, it's an opportunity to remember who you are and who it is you serve. Look at what Nehemiah does. He shows us this in the next few verses. It does exactly this thing. There's opposition, and then in verse 4, Nehemiah says this, "Hear, O our God, for we are despised." Like we are experiencing opposition. But look what he says. "Turn back their taunt on their own heads and give them up to be plundered in the land where they are captives." I love this sort of stuff, right? Like, let them live our life. That's what he's saying. "Do not cover up their guilt and let not their sin be blotted out from your sight. For they have provoked" who? You to anger in the presence of the builders. I love this. I love this. And here's why. Because Nehemiah goes right back to God. He says, listen, this opposition that I'm facing, this isn't opposition against me. This is opposition against God. Because I'm not doing what I wanted to do. I'm doing what you wanted me to do, which means this opposition that's facing me right now is actually opposition that's facing you. And that changes the conversation and the dialogue completely. God, this isn't me. This is your deal. You put me on this task. I didn't put me on this task, which means that this opposition is now yours to deal with, not mine to deal with. You see how powerful this is? When you and I begin to live lives that are purposed by God, when you and I become the conduits of His love and His grace, when we become the ones who are acting on His behalf in the middle of injustice, suddenly the opposition gets reframed. And now people might be questioning identity, they might be questioning ability, but what they don't see is the God that you and I serve. They don't understand that behind this broken, incapable person who has a past is a God who says, I chose you to do this. There's a God who wants a wall built. There's a God who wants people to flourish. There's a God who's with us. That's what opposition presents to us. And stepping out in faith and living beyond yourself and saying, I'm going to live this sort of life, it does not mean you're not going to face opposition. But it does mean that you won't face it alone. Because this was not your idea. It was his idea. And so when we step out in faith, God does something that's amazing and something beautiful happens. Look at verse 6. I love this because it just goes on. What did they do? They face opposition. Verse 6 says, so we built the wall. We just kept going, right? Because opposition's a part of the deal. We built the wall. We didn't question. We didn't say, God, did we go the wrong direction? Should we have gone somewhere else? We just built the wall. And all the wall was joined together to half its height, for the people had a mind or a heart to work. Like they got into this thing. That's what Nehemiah says. Like they were in it to win it. But the opposition continues. Look at verse 7. It says, but when Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabs and the Ammonites and the Ashdodites heard that the repairing of the walls of Jerusalem was going forward and that the breaches were beginning to be closed, they were very angry. And they all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and to cause confusion in it. And look at what they did, because this is incredibly beautiful. Verse 9, and we prayed to our God and set a guard as protection against them day and night. And kind of continues on. I love this. There's something really cool that's like embedded in this. I love this. There's a cool picture painted in verse 21. So we labored at the work, and half of them held the spears from the break of dawn until the stars came out. I also said to the people at that time, let every man and his servant pass the night within Jerusalem, inside the walls, that they may be on guard for us by night and may labor by day. So neither I nor my brothers, nor my servants, nor the men of the guard who followed me, none of us took off our clothes. Each kept his weapon in his right hand. In the verses before this, there's this picture that they were working with one hand and holding swords with the other. And I love it because their response to opposition was prayer and posting guards. We prayed to God, and then we posted a guard. The Bible is continually speaking about the sovereignty of God and human responsibility together. We have a tendency to separate these two. We say things like this: well, if God is sovereign and in control, then we shouldn't have to set a guard. Because he's God, right? So if God wants the wall built, then he should keep these people at bay. Like, let them strike them with lightning or do something miraculous and crazy. But we shouldn't have to do anything, right? Isn't that our thinking? Like, if God is sovereign and God is in this and God is going to be faithful to me as I press forward for him, then he just needs to do that. And I'm just going to pray, right? We're just going to pray. And if God wants the wall to be continued, well, it's just going to happen. So let's all get together, sing Kumbaya, and do our thing. That's the way that we tend to think, right? We separate it. Or this is the other thing church people tend to do. If we set a guard, this is what church people say. If you set a guard, if you go, okay, we're going to do this, like we prayed, but now here we go. We got our swords and we're going to face this opposition. Church people go, well, you're not trusting God, right? You're not trusting God. So you're either just going to wait for God to do something because he's sovereign, or if you do something, you're not trusting him. But what Nehemiah shows us is, no, you do both. They prayed first and acknowledged God's sovereignty. God is in this. They posted guard second. There is human responsibility. See, we tend to separate the two, right? We say, if this isn't happening the way we thought, well, then God, we start questioning God's sovereignty, right? Well, God, you're not sovereign. You must not be working. You must not be who you promised to be. And so we start questioning him. But what Nehemiah is showing us is there's God's sovereignty right alongside of, enmeshed with human responsibility. What does this mean? Well, it means in the large scope of what's going on in the world, God is in charge, but at the same time, what you do matters. You matter. Your life matters. You can make a difference. That's what this is saying. God's people doing radical things for him. They're going to face opposition, but that opposition comes because you're making a difference. This is a beautiful thing for us to hear because we live in a culture that has been shaped completely around being a spectator, right? Like most of us are spectators. We're told to sit on the sidelines and watch, and we put other people in the game to play for us, right? To represent us. We're constantly told in our culture that we are insignificant, that we're individual. You just go do your thing, seek your pleasure, do your thing, live your comfortable life, and we'll take care of the details over here. But what God says is this: you matter. Your life matters. God's people don't need to be powerful. They don't need a story. They don't need to be in charge. But they can still accomplish great things for Him. On one hand, God is completely in charge. And on the other hand, what you do matters. See, opposition, it turns out, has an answer. In fact, Jesus gives us an answer that Nehemiah didn't even have to the opposition. Jesus says, Jesus says, when you get persecuted, it's not a matter of if, when you get persecuted, when you get despised, put it in the context of what I did for you. If you want to deal with opposition, put it in the context of what I did for you. What does that say about those places where you experience opposition? What does what I have done for you say about the opposition that you face? What I've done for you says something about your identity that nobody can undo, right? And what I've done for you, what does it say about your identity? What Jesus has done for us on the cross, what does that say? It says like nothing else in our life that we matter, that we have value, that we have purpose and meaning, right? We look to the cross, and it doesn't matter what criticism anyone levels against us, nothing can override the value that the cross places on us. You matter. Your identity, you are a beautiful son. You are a beautiful daughter of God. You have meaning and purpose. What does it say about your ability? Well, it says you have ability beyond yourself. The entire message of the Bible, the entire message of the New Testament in particular, are individuals who have brokenness and faults being used by God to bring radical change in the places where they live. Your ability extends beyond what people can see. You have God with you. It's this beautiful picture that's painted. What does it say about your citizenship? People question whether or not you belong or whether or not you have influence. And yes, are there times when you feel like you don't belong? Are there times when you feel like you don't fit? Maybe it's the place that you live, the city you live in, the community. Maybe it's the political party that you're supposed to vote with or not vote with or whatever. And you say, I don't really fit. What does Jesus say about citizenship? He says, you're a citizen of something completely different, something completely other, and you do belong. You are mine. And if you get despised, you know what Jesus says? You will never be put to shame. Not doing my thing. You're never going to be put to shame living your life for me. That's what Jesus says. I want to close with this. I want to just share a little bit from my own story. In 2005, about 10 years ago, Sherry and I decided to move to New York City and plant 10 churches in 5 years. No big deal. Somebody asked us, we were too young to know what we were getting into, and so we said yes. And I remember talking to the guy on the phone who had kind of talked me into this outrageous plan to move to like the toughest city on the planet to start a church. And I remember listening to him and talking, and like the week or two before we were leaving, he said, hey, I'm going to be praying for you because beginning from this point forward, I really believe you have a target on your back. And he said those words, and they hung in my ears because I was like, whoa. You didn't tell me about a target when I signed up for this, right? Like, what do you mean target on your back? And he just said, I really believe that you're taking ground, you're sacrificing your life, you're putting things on the line, your comfort, your discomfort, now to do something good for what God wants in the world. Before that week was out, my youngest daughter, while we were loading a truck to move to New York, my youngest daughter was run over by a car in front of our house. I remember driving to the hospital wondering whether or not she was going to live. And suddenly I was like, is this the target? And did it already start? Is this already the opposition? And then I started questioning, like, who am I? Like, should I be doing this? Am I making a mistake with my family? Like, this is nuts. But somehow we made it through that week and we pressed forward. My daughter lived, broken leg, hurt pinky. And unbelievably, like tire track across her chest, scary, frightening moment. We moved to New York City. moved there and had this like up and down roller coaster experience of living in New York. Got the opportunity. How many of you ever heard of Tim Keller? Anyone heard of him? So spent about a year and a half being mentored by Tim and just spending time every month, just him investing in me and me meeting with him. And we're starting a church and hiring other people to come and plant churches and thinking about all these things in the city. And in the middle of all this good stuff, there were these moments that were so incredibly dark. Like there was just stuff that was so overwhelming, I didn't think I could even get through it. And I remember one particular day having this one meeting with Tim, and he was just praising so many of the good things that were happening with what we were doing. And I remember him also then simultaneously saying, I just don't know how you're going to survive. And we didn't. We didn't. Like it was that dark, and eventually like it just got that hard. And I started spiraling. Personally, I just began spiraling. And we, without really telling a lot of people, just kind of pulled up stakes and left. And we moved back to Spokane. And my plan was to hide. I just thought I never want to put my family on the line. I'm never going to risk again. I'm just going to cover my butt because I can't trust God to do it for me. And so for the next few years, I just floundered. Bounced from a couple different jobs, was a financial advisor for a little bit. That was fun. 100% commission. You go. And then I found myself back on staff at a church here in town, and some of you know part of that story, and probably not all of it, but found myself kind of licking my wounds and on staff at a church. And can I just tell you, it was so comfortable. It was so good. Like, I didn't have to preach on Sundays. So we went skiing every Saturday. I skied 39 times one winter because I didn't care what was happening on Sunday. I just had to show up at church. So I was like, let's go, life was good and easy. I had a good team. I didn't have a lot of responsibility. I was just kind of rolling along. And then I'm at this conference down in California, and I'm listening during some worship, and I just hear this gentle whisper of the Lord say, I want you to pastor people again. And I sat in the stands at this crazy event, and I said, God, I don't want to. Like, I know what comes with that. And I'm like, my life is good. We're good. Began wrestling with that, and a very short time later, there's an invitation to become the pastor here at Summit. And you know what I thought? I don't want to. I'm comfortable. My life is good. But I knew that I was supposed to do this. I knew that this was where God was leading me all along. And so in 2010... January 1st was my first official day here. And within 2 weeks, both of our cars got totaled. One of them blew up. The other one I rolled up at Schweitzer. God didn't want me skiing anymore. But we totaled both of our cars. And we were like, man, this is crazy. This is like nuts. We don't really have the money to solve this crisis, but we'll kind of figure this out. Well, that was just the beginning. And over the next several months, things just began to happen. Stuff just started unraveling in our life. Stuff that we just could not explain. Like every time, it was like every single week I woke up and thought, what's it going to be this week? We had friendships, lifelong friendships that imploded, and there was no explanation for why they imploded. We started getting phone calls. That particular year, Sherry and I, between our two families, we lost 6 family members that year. 6 family members. If you divide that over 12 months, that means every other month somebody was passing away, and it was somebody who was close to us. And so it was like, man, who's next? We just kind of kept wondering that. One particular night in the summer, we were meeting with some friends who we were trying to like smooth things over, some of the brokenness in our relationship. We're literally praying with them, and as we finish praying, we get a phone call. It's an unexpected phone call from Sherry's family in Portland, and they said, hey, you guys need to get down here. Your dad's in the hospital, and it looks like he's not going to make it. You need to hurry. I mean, this is like one thing after another. This is how this particular year was going. And so we raced to Portland, and we had a couple of days with Sherry's dad, and he died. We never imagined that he would die. And he passed away. And unbelievably, while we were there, my daughter had a cut on her foot. And while we were in the hospital down in Portland, that cut got infected with a 1 in a million virus that a week and a half later took her to ICU while Sherry was still down in Portland. And I had to call my wife because doctors looked at me and said, if your wife wants to see your daughter alive, she needs to get here. She scrambles on a plane. People won't even let her fly in their place. She's scrambling to get on a flight. She gets here. We end up spending 8 days in ICU, and miraculously our daughter lived to tell about it. I remember standing there at one point. I remember thinking about the year and then thinking about this, like at this climax. I remember thinking, we can't buy a cup of coffee downstairs at the hospital, much less pay the bills that are going to start rolling in. Like, I just remember thinking, what is left, It seemed like every single time we turned around, something else imploded. The elders here at Summit, they made a couple of Job references when we meet. And I was like, yeah, I feel like it. Like Job, Old Testament character, crazy stuff happened. Shouldn't have, but it did. That was me. I was like, this doesn't make any sense. Had a friend here at Summit who said, hey, can I take you to Alaska fishing? And I was like, do you think that's a good idea? And it wasn't. We got stranded on an island for several days. I'm not exaggerating. And we had to eat the fish we caught. Like, we're eating the fish. And he's like, is this like the norm? Well, yeah, this is it, right? Like, this is just the way things go. Month after month as I began here at Summit. And it went on like that. It went on for a while, Scott, right? It just went on like, it seemed like it was never letting out. We were just like, they would just shake their heads and pray and say like, man, we don't know what's going on with you. By the way, do you know what was happening during all of that time here at Summit? God was working. God was moving. Things were happening. Things have continued to happen. And you know what I remember thinking? I remember going, God, it'd be really great if you'd let me breathe a little. It'd be really great if I could just be at my best. I've been a good leader a lot of my life. Maybe you could just let me lead on all 8 cylinders instead of sitting in this place of randomness. And then I remembered this prayer that I prayed. I remember saying in the early days when I first came to Summit, I said, Lord, whatever you do at Summit, let it be very clear that it's not me and that it's you. I thought he'd have other ways of doing that. But his way of doing that was me walking through obstacle after obstacle and just discovering who he is and leaning on him and trusting him and knowing this opposition isn't against me, it's against him. And who I am is a saved son of God who is doing what his Father asked him to do. And he will be faithful. He will be faithful. There will be opposition. Stuff's going to happen. But there's nothing like living your life and knowing that God is with you. Amen. That's what I want to pray for you. Would you stand with me? Jesus, everything about this message seems to fly in the face of what our culture says. Our culture says be comfortable. Our culture says live for yourself. Our culture says obstacles mean you're not going the right direction. And yet those obstacles confirm. Those obstacles remind us of who you are. Lord, would you allow our minds and our hearts to be changed? And would you transform us into people who willingly, with faith, step out to trust you more than we trust ourselves. We love you, Lord, and we pray this in your name. Amen.